Hi everyone. Today we're going to be picking up where we left off the other day, which, well, we talked about the first four cycles, the first four symbols of Samoin, and how they're all connected. And so today we're going to continue on. We mentioned a bit about Iaio, the fifth sign in Samoin, which is also correlated to the fifth cycle. And the we mentioned that the Samoin is the foundation, the inner foundation, compared to the Ah, which was the outer foundation. Well, it's a number of things, but one thing that it does do is it's a sort of a repetition, we might say, of the cosmos. Only now it's on the outer, on the inner realm rather than the outer realm. And so, so we're going to be building our vertical foundation in the fifth cycle. Now in astrology, the fifth house is often known as the house of children and creativity and so forth, and that's connected with this Iaio, which we mentioned was the elevator, the up and down, the downward forever, upward forever. The fifth cycle of any span that we're looking at, we can expect that there to be some type of endeavor that is innovative or inventive, something creative, brand new. But we also need to keep in mind that when in dealing with cycles, that there are cycles within cycles, and when we're looking at cycles, we have to understand that at any particular point in time, there are many cycles in play, and we have to give due weight to each cycle, and that's where the labor and prophecy can become quite detailed and quite in depth. And so while all these cycles will be in play, the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and so forth, still there will be other cycles, and these other cycles will have some impact, and they may be an ascendancy, whereas some other cycles, well, while they'll be there playing a role, they would be basically role players. They wouldn't be the star player, so to speak. Now we find out from Oahspe that there's many things that can influence mortals as well as spirits, and some of those things have to do with unseen cycles. And these cycles that we're talking about now, these are rudimentary cycles. These are foundational cycles. Now it says in Oahspe, the cycles, you have listed the 100-year cycle, 200-year cycle, 66-year cycle, 18-year cycle, 365, cycle of 365, which has to do with the year and all that. And Oahspe says, now these cycles have nothing to do with numbers per se, meaning that they relate to something, to some cyclical thing, event that just recurs. So for example, in the 400-year cycle, well, that's called one time. It's an atmospherian time, and it's for one complete wave, one whole wave of the Great Serpent, which is the solar system. And a half time or a half wave is 200 years, and so forth. And so, while the cycles that we're talking about apply to that, if you count up into these cycles and all that, and you can't apply them and all that. The cycles in Oahspe, we have to understand, are essentially for humanity to perceive that which is detrimental to his health in many respects, because they talk about times of falling Oahspe, which is semi-darkness, atmospheric darkness. In the etheric solution, that which affects our spirit, man's spirit, is semi-dark. And if it's falling, it's going to become denser and denser in the darkness. Well, Jaya is another season, which is a season of semi-light. So there's some darkness there, but it's lightening up if we're rising toward Dan. But if we're falling in the Jaya, well, then it's pressing down. It's moving toward the darkness. These come in cycles as well, but there's also some free play there, according to the Shrivars, those who are guardian angels over essentially the elements and the roadway that the earth is going to be traveling through and all that. And they can choose whether to give Dan, which is a time of light, Ethereal light, atmospheric light, or Jaya or Ajaya or even Nebula. The main considerations here is the mortals themselves, rather than the atmospherian spirits, who were of course one-time mortals, but they're in atmospheria around the earth, the heavens around the earth, that go in gradations all the way out to the moon. We have some times of falling Ajai or falling Jaya that's moving toward Ajai, which has certain reactions within humanity. And so the decisions of the Shrivars, of the councils up there, of Orions, generally they're of Orion level, but they could be higher. And of course they have apprentices and so forth. But anyway, they make their decision with regard to the mortal themselves, and in particular they want to make sure that the mortal has everything in the elements to work with so that his soul can grow. Plus they also want the mortals to keep perpetuating on the planet, because this is where mortal souls are born, in corporea. And not just this corporeal planet, but other corporeal planets. And but when they're looking at ours specifically, that's what they look for. They look for the grade, and they look at certain densities, and they look at certain opaqueness and depth of our ethi and our where we are in relationship to where we should be and where we could be. And so they make their decisions, and so that falls somewhat outside the realm of cycles. And so what we're saying is that while cycles are important to know, we also have to understand that there are other mitigating influences or different emergent situations which are not necessarily perceived. Now they may be cyclical, but they may not be perceived by mortals or even by the Atmospherians as to what those cycles are, and yet they still might be cyclical. But when they happen at the time, they just seem out of the blue, and so they just happen, so we take things in stride. That is just an aspect of prophesying for peoples and what's going to happen here during Cosmin and so forth. That can be applied to Earth, and if it's applied to Earth rather than for the benefit of humanity, but for self purposes or whatever, and if that's done, the person who does this, their perception drops down into the Earth, and they'll basically get answered with Earth rather than with the S, and the angels of Jehovah, because the angels of Jehovah are working toward Jehovah's kingdom, and they will work through corporea, but they're working for the advantage of everyone. And so in applying prophecy, so we have to bear in mind as well that while these cycles can be applied to lower means, it's better to use them for the betterment of humanity. the question someone might ask arise, well, why even impart this information if you know certain things are going to happen? Isn't that bad? Isn't that going to hurt? Well, actually, if you know something, certain things that are going to occur, you can be prepared for them. And does that negate what's going to happen? Well, it just depends. You see, if you're down in corporea and you give real specific things like, oh, A, B, C is going to happen because of the precursors X, Y, Z. Well, and then if it doesn't quite turn out that way, well, then this because they tried to become too specific with it. And you have to be really good at this in order to get that specific in any event. But in the larger sense, to prepare for something that's coming. Now, this is one of the reasons why Oahspe gave the prophecy, these elements of prophecy, and why they're important, why you need them. And because of these Ajai and Jaya, that these times, now when the Jaya comes, which is the semi-light, and if it's rising and falling, well, one of the things that occurs amongst mortals during that time is fevers, because of the atmosphere that is conducive for the perpetuation and propagation of bacteria and viruses and so forth. It's sort of like their milieu. And man, if he's been unclean, when he goes forward to do something and encounters the Jaya, depending upon how clean or unclean he is and what he does, it may magnify this tendency to be aware of the distance between health and dissolution, basically, is what it is. And so we learn in Oahspe that there are cycles of events. These times of falling Ajai and Jaya, some of them are cyclical, and we can know about those. And when they are, it says in Oahspe that we can be prepared for these, and we can know what to do with regard to them, or we can learn what to do with regard to them. Now, Oahspe does not tell everyone, or anyone for that matter, exactly what to do in this situation, because they leave that for us to find out, to figure out, to determine. Because first of all, the angels don't want us dependent on them. They want us to be able to stand on our own. And it's not that they're going to ignore us either, but the idea is that we need to learn how to go forth and deal with that, with our environment, with the elements of our surroundings. Essentially, the reason why prophecy was given to mortals in that regard, for health purposes and to assist man to prepare. Now, they talk about during the Danhai cycle, the periods that man goes through as regularly as the tide, they say. And so by knowing these, we can prepare ahead. Now, it's really not much different than having a granary. You know, if you know a famine is coming, you have a granary filled with food so to tide you over. So yes, it is good to be able to know these things and to apply them. And it's whether or not it should be given out or not. Well, it's the old thought of, well, if you invent something, it can always be used for evil. It can be used for either good or evil. And so do you hold it back? And so for example, way back when, a knife. Now, a knife, you can cut fruit and vegetables and you can eat. You know, it helps you to eat using that utensil. And but of course we also know that it can be used for evil. And so the question is, you know, do you invent a knife because it can be used for evil, or do you invent a knife for the good that comes about it? And of course that's a decision that each person has to undertake, whoever is coming forth with that invention or innovation, whatever it may be. But with regard to prophecy then, when we, in understanding these cycles, we can understand that they can be applied to evil purposes as well as to good ends. We know from how Jehovah has his heaven structured that even those who do evil ultimately will turn good and make amends for it and so forth, and be able to rise up in resurrection and in ascension. And meanwhile, they had developed some of their talents while they were doing their evil. Nevertheless, in the study and in the use of cycles, then we can find ways to help humanity. And so, and we'll look at those later on in this series of talks. So now, when we get back here to the first four cycles, and then we go on to the fifth cycle, and what exactly does the fifth cycle mean, and the fifth reality from Samoin, which is the EAO? Well, we talked somewhat about what it means, but it also means many other things besides that, the things that we talked about. But one of the things that it does that's of importance that we just barely touched on, which is that it's the start, the restart of the 1, 2, 3, 4. And remember, the 1, 2, 3, 4 are the foundation, the O, which is the perception of the foundation, the objectivity of it, and so forth, and then the ESC, which is the third combination, and then the ESAC, which was the cosmos. And the cosmos being the whole. And so, and this had to do with the outer foundation. But now we're working 5, 6, 7, 8. The next 4, the next set of 4. And so 5 becomes the foundation, and it's the inner foundation that we're working on for the next set of 4. Although it can also be applied to the outer foundation, because the outer foundation doesn't go away even though you're dealing with the inner foundation. The foundation cycle of all, which is the Ah, that's always there. It's always there, but it's just whether you focus on it or not, whether you're laboring with that, working in that field, so to speak. But it's always there, but it may be in the background rather than in the forefront, as it is when you're working in the first cycle. That's in the forefront, the foundation. Fifth cycle, the EAO is to the forefront. And so, now a person has choice, you see, because that's what we have. That's really what we own. We don't really own anything else, but we have our choice. We have a choice. Always choice inside us. We choose everything, what to do, what to say, when to go, how we're going to live, everything. We have that choice to serve Jehovah or to fawn on Satan itself, which, as it says in Oahspe. So we have that choice. And that's what we own. We own our choices. And so the fifth cycle represents, in a sense, this choice, our choice. You know, where are we going to go on the elevator? And so that depends, you see, upon what needs to be done, really, and where a person is in their grade and so forth. And when you rise up and down on the EAO, on the elevator, you can rise up in light and higher, more rarefication, or into the light, and more rarefied light, or you can drop down into the darkness, into the density, into the depths, and the point in between, the horizon. Remember, that's what we talked about, the horizon, the Ah that was established way back in the first cycle. That is essentially, that becomes the 0 point, or the neutral point, the ground point, and then you have darkness below and light up above. And so, In EAO, you can rise way up or you can rise way down. Well, according to how far we're able to, or a person chooses to do, if they have a certain amount of mastery over rising and descending and then coming back up and so forth. So, so in looking at like a society, for example, or a people's, a nation, or even the world, we can look to see where they are, what their grade is, and then we can know where they're going to be lifting up to or sinking down to, as the case may be, with regard to whatever it is that the object that we're looking at to prophesy over. And that can be seen in the EAO. Well, it's one of the places that it can be seen. There's other places where it can be seen, but we won't touch on that now. The EAO sets the foundation, the inner foundation. Even though it's still working on the outer, in the outer realm, it's also but it is also the establishment of this inner foundation, where we are going to go on the elevator. And now sometimes we don't choose, we just get lifted or drop down, depending upon, if we're part of the social order and the social order goes up or down, we tend to go up and down with it. Well, we do to some extent, and we're told that in Oahspe, the grade of the nation, everybody in that nation is affected by the overall grade of the nation. And that only makes sense. I mean, if you have a lot of people who are in light, that's going to uplift everybody. But if you have a lot of people down in darkness or despair or confusion or whatever, well, that's going to affect everyone too. And that's all a part of the EAO. You know, where are you in basically in the grades or the object that we're looking at for the purpose of prophesying. You know, where is it going to be and how's it going to work out? Oh, we might also mention with regard to the those who would use prophecy for self purposes, that actually because it's being sown in self, it will come back to a person. The sowing, and then you get the reaping. But the reaping for self, you see, is more self, and it actually rather leaves a person in a worse condition than when they started. And so that's why it's always important to sow in light and in peace and harmony and brotherhood. And by brotherhood we mean fraternity, which by that we mean essentially family, but family in a special type of a way, not a blood family, but like a spiritual family, we might say. And we won't get into it now, the definition of fraternity and all that, but just to let you know that there's nothing sexist about by saying brotherhood, at least when I'm talking, that is not going to be, because we're all brothers and sisters, every one of us. We're all, no matter our age or anything, we're all brothers and sisters of one great spirit. Let's look at about going forward in this EAO, because you have this EAO. Well, okay, now you might have been taken on an elevator, the social order or your group, your family that you were in, your fraternity, it may be at a certain level, and then you go along with that level. But you still have choice. You still have choice within that, because there's always things within a thing, and choices within choices. And so we come to the next sign in Samoin, which is the Hoi. Now the Hoi, which is basically your circle with the true cross in it, the upright cross, equal lengths and touching the edge of the circle. Let's look at how that came about, and how that came about was the cosmos. You recall what the cosmos looks like, which is the circle with the horizon in it. And in creation there's something called the drift, which is essentially an unwinding kind of a thing. It's a movement toward from the masculine to the feminine, from the concentrated to the less concentrated, from the corpor to S. Although we have a cosmos, it's not and it's stable, but it's not dead. It's living, and there's motion involved. Where there's life, there's motion, and that's part of the drift. And so it changes from where it was. It's still a cosmos, but it's in change. And the Ieo, in a sense, represents the drift and the opposite of the foundation, of the outer foundation, being the inner foundation. And so Ieo, what Ieo does is Ieo looks first at that inner foundation and says, okay, here's our new horizon point, essentially. And 6, which is the Hoi, says, okay, yeah, all right, there's our horizon, and there's our height and our depth. And so, yeah, we see this ideal, because that's what Hoi is. Hoi represents one of the things is idealism, ideal. What is the ideal? And it's the all good, of course, is the ideal. And how do you get to the ideal? How do you sustain the ideal and all that? Well, of course, we have to be careful, because now in Oahspe, it says that one of the things this means is the create and the uz. Create and the uz. Now, uz means destroying, destruction. When we look at an ideal, you know, how do we get there? How do we attain to that ideal? The means and the end itself, you know, that we want to get to. And we know from experience that the uz, what's the uz part? Well, from the ideal, how can you get bad from good? Because if you have too much of a good thing, if you have too much sugar, it'll turn your stomach sour, it'll make you sick. And so there's always a balance that has to be understood where it is. When we look at a social order or whatever it is that we're looking at for prophesying purposes, and we look at it and we wonder, well, all right, well, where is this social order going? And how's it going to end up? And so we look at the ideals of that social order. And we look at where they are in relationship to that ideal, and whether that's the ideal of who is it the ideal of. So is it just the ideal of a few people, or is it most of the people? So all these things that need to be taken into consideration when thinking about the 6th cycle. And ideals, before it becomes an ideal, starts as an idea, which is part of the Ieo process. The L, ideal, essentially manifests it outward. We can also say that Hoi is a manifestation of both the inner and the outer. So it's the inner realm that we're working with in numbers 5, 6, 7, and 8. 5, 6, 7, 8, those 4. Because that's the second part of the it's the second cycle of the cosmos, essentially. And so while we're still working on the inner, but it's in relationship to the outer, specifically when we're working with the ideal. One looks to see whether or not, you know, what's going to, what the music is, what's the flow, because that's what 6 represents in a sense of, we look at number 1 as the foundation. We mentioned was love, as being the foundation. Wisdom, power, and the 4th, the Isak, was the harmony. And the 5th, the Ieo, is the symmetry. Symmetry is essentially the reflex of wisdom, even as harmony is the reflex of love. Another way of saying this is that love is like the personal aspect of it, the engaging aspect. And harmony, it's the opposite side of the coin, so to speak, or the other end of the continuum. It's like it's reflex. It's like the impersonal love, an expression of the impersonal love. And so symmetry is, we might think of it as being the impersonal aspect of wisdom. Because wisdom, or wise dominion, is exactly that. How do we proceed wisely? How do we proceed so that everybody has love and fulfillment? That the opportunity for fulfillment is there. That the way for progression, for resurrection, for ascension is opened and provided for wisely. Provided for in ways that benefit for the whole. Essentially in the ways that Jehovah says is the highest, best way to go. Symmetry is the reflection of that wise dominion. It's the impersonal aspect of it. So you might think of, like for example, an earthquake or a piece of ice on a lake that's frozen over and it cracks, and where those cracks appear, that's all symmetry. You look at a tree, and how is the tree going to grow this way and branches that way and that way? That's all symmetry. Someone somewhere up there made a decision somewhere or out there, and it happens that way. It breaks along those lines. That's symmetry. Now, we may or may not be able to see the symmetry in everything, but the symmetry is always there. And it may seem very, very lopsided. And you could say, well, that looks very unsymmetrical to me. And perhaps to a certain tastes and to the greater judgment of most people, it might certainly be that way. But there's also ways of looking at it to see the symmetry. Because when we look at symmetry, we might just look at form and say, well, this has just a little bit there and it seems like out of... But if you add color in it and you add depth to it and you add shading and texture, and you can balance them out. You can balance them out so you can, and you go, oh yeah, well I didn't see that, and that's how come they have symmetry, because they're, I didn't see the lines of cleavage there and there and there and there and the facets. Symmetry itself is a very fascinating aspect, but that's also a part of the fifth, of the Ieo aspect. Well, music is also an impersonal aspect, an impersonal reflex, but it's the impersonal reflex of music, of power. Music is, because music is basically your flow, the flow, and that's all. When it comes to you impersonally, when it's an impersonal thing, then that's the flow. That's now. It may not seem like music. You can say, "Oh, that's noise," but somebody else could come along and go, oh yeah, I can detect the tune in there, I see the melody, or I see what's going on, there's a certain rhythm there, and so forth. And so that's all flow. When we look at cycles, we look at the sixth, what influence, if any, that is playing at the time. Because all these absolutely do have an influence, but it's just how much weight that we give to each of these. While there may be many flows, they all, and they may be trying to converge on one point. And how are they going to interact, and what's going to be the outcome of that? And that's part of the things that cycles can help with, and we can also learn from music itself, from the study, the theoretical study of musical instrumentation, and the theory of music, and symphonies, and different types of tones and colors and so forth, the timbres and voices. It can all be very educational and applicable to prophecy purposes. So when we think about the flow, which is essentially another name for music. Now, grace, so when someone is graceful, we say, well, they have a good flow about them, they have a good feeling about them, and we say they're graceful. And that means that basically their music, their corporeal movements, are in tune, in sync with the music of Jehovah's corporea, the flow of his corporeal body. And so that's why they're graceful. It was one of the things that was taught. This was taught all the way back at the time of Apollo, when man was taught harmony, symmetry, and music. And so man grew to appreciate these traits, these qualities back then. And then today, in Oahspe now, we're able to articulate these things and put it into broader context, more comprehensive understanding of how they all fit together. In looking at the ideal, you know, what is the ideal, what should be the ideal, and so forth, and that goes all the way to the person's foundation, what they have for a foundation, and what a nation has for a foundation, what a society, what a group, what a fraternity, what a family, what a community has for their foundation. Because that's what they're going to be building on, and what they hold for ideals and where they start will tell you a lot about where they are in that process and how it's going to turn out and when it's going to turn out and so forth. Because these cycles can also be used for timing purposes, which is where we get the prediction and the predictions and the prophecies that come forth from these. We can look and we can know an ideal and perceive what the subject's ideal is, and where it is in relationship possibly to other ideals that are going to be surrounding it and so forth. And if they're converging, as we mentioned, on a point, and how is that all going to work out? And so there's where you have, that's the create and the Oahspe, that's a part of the create and the Oahspe. And we know that from music, even though it may sound like noise to somebody else, it can sound like music. Well, I mean, there is a quote in Oahspe, or I should say a passage in Oahspe, that talks about the goddesses who were older than the essentially any planet that's out there. They've been around long enough where they've seen planets get born, live, pass out of existence, so that when they're looking out, they've seen everything that was never there when they were, earlier in their life. So it's all brand new to them in that sense. And it says that to them, these things that happen with corporea and everything like that, the moving of the planets, it's all music, and to them, to their ears, and they're perceiving the soul, the harmony of the whole thing, because that's the beauty of love, wisdom, power, harmony, symmetry, music as well, is that true wisdom, wise dominion, is built upon love. It's not divorced from love. It's an affirmation of love, but more than an affirmation of love, it's an assistance for love to move forward. And because remember, the wisdom is more abstract than the love, which is more the subjective. And so you have wisdom, which is built upon love, while power, true power, and the most potent power, is not divorced from wisdom nor love. It's the same with harmony, symmetry, music. So symmetry, all symmetry, has harmony within it. You may have to look for it to find it, but it's there. Harmony underlies everything. It's it's the cosmos. It's the note of the cosmos, so to speak. Well, symmetry then is built upon harmony, and the more harmonious in a situation, the more harmonious an act of wisdom is, and an act of symmetry, because even though you have, you might decide, well, let's go do this, this, and this, and this, and that's going to have repercussions. That's the symmetry. That's going to cause all these things, waves, to happen, and those who are recipients of these waves, for them, that is symmetry happening, occurring to them, because that's impersonal to them. It's not, you're not directing it sort of at them per se, or interacting with them in that regard. And so, the more harmonious symmetry is, so that you have an artist who can create something of beautiful symmetry, and it has harmony within it. You see, but if they're out of tune with the harmony of the group, then it may look atrocious. Their act of symmetry, and so symmetry is built upon harmony, and then we look to see whether you can look to see whether it's being perceived, that harmony is being perceived or not. But also, and we look at music, then the flow, well, what we call good music or musical has those elements in it. It has symmetry in it, and it has harmony. And so good music, a good flow, has harmonies, and chords and beautiful stuff, and symmetries, the beat and the rhythm and so forth. So it has all that symmetry in it. The flow has all those things. The music does. And so when we look at number 6 and the 6th cycle, which is the Hoi, we take all those things into consideration. Ideally, we take all those things into consideration in order to understand how it's going to turn out in the end. If that's what our intention is as far as prophesying, it may be just to see what's coming up and then preparing for it. When you have 6 is the ideal. You have the ideal in number 6, but 6, the Hoi itself drifts. Okay, and it's drifting. Well, for you looking there, it would drift this way. And boom, and what do you have there? Is you have what's called the extreme. It's Dru, D-R-U-H, in the Tablet of Samoyed, which is the 7th condition. And now it's a little bit awkward for me to go that way, so I'm going to rotate this way because I can do it better. And so there's your extremes. That's number 7. Okay, you start out with Hoi and you had the drift, went to the extremes. Now what happens if you go past the extremes? Well, it starts being upright again, only now it's... So in other words, this point here is the extreme from the upright. Okay? The 45 degrees. Yes, but it's a true cross at the 45 degrees. But now, what happens if you drift a little bit beyond that? Well, now that all depends. Because if you drift a little bit beyond that, if you're not one with Jehovah, it's a collapse. It causes a collapse. 7 is known, among other things, as limitations or limits. You can know where the limits are. But it's also understanding. It's perceiving something in clarity to a certain extent, depending upon the grade of a person who's doing the perceiving. In another sense, 7 is the fullness, represents the fullness of the ideal. Because you're starting off with the ideal and you're drifting. And you drift, and you drift, and you drift. And while that's going on, you're experiencing the ideal. And you take it to the extreme, to the fullness of that ideal. And then, depending upon essentially how close one is to Jehovah, we have a collapse. We have a collapse once the drift continues on. And so, and this may seem, well, that's a bad thing, but no, it's actually a good thing. Because we need to slough off stuff that's no longer necessary. We need to perceive what works and what doesn't work. And so that's good. It's good. It can be bad or it can be good, depending upon how it's perceived. What we're dealing with the Dru then is limitation and also understanding. We gain understanding. You see, when you go through the drift and then you have the collapse, well, then you gain a lot. You understand a lot. Oh, well, I didn't know that was going to happen, or I did. Oh, hey, look at this beautiful stuff that happened. You know, because we did that. We took it to its fullness, and it was virtuous. It was the light instead of instead of the dark. And yes, we could see how to rearrange it now. We understand how to do it better. 8 represents, after the collapse, the things that are left over, essentially, after you go past the extremes, and you lose that stuff that isn't essential. Then you're left with the nub, with the quick, with the heart of what it is that we need to experience, that we need to grow with, that we need to continue rising up in toward, ideally. Well, so when you have a collapse, it can collapse into chaos. We know that. We've seen it enough times to know that. And this chaos is essentially, it collapses to what we would call a field, meaning a milieu, technically into a higher order. It actually went into a higher order. The framework went from this framework, collapsed into a larger, and now a larger framework is now in charge, and that's the field. And what we have for the symbol of Samoyed is EOI. And in the middle of that field, that collapsed field, is a single leaf. And that leaf represents life. It represents organization. It represents the condensation, the crystallization, the bringing together into a unit, into a whole. It represents regeneration. From that, we're going to go forth again. And so that leaf of life, which is EOI, the creator of all, the sustainer of all, the I Am that is everywhere and present here and everywhere. The leaf of that life is always here. That's the beauty of the 8th cycle. It's always here. There's always an 8th cycle going on somewhere. We can always tune into it if we need to, or would like to. In other words, we can always tune in to the ever-present Creator, to the all-perfect, to the all-whole, to the all-harmony that is contained within a impervious unity. 8 is equivalent, and using the force 1, 2, 3, 4 cosmos, it's the cosmos of the Ieo, of the upright, of the inner foundation. Because we started with the inner foundation and then we labored with it in the outer foundation, we got our ideal, we went and went forth in that ideal. Now it doesn't have to be a drift. You can actually go forth in your Hoi and take it to the extremes. But there's always the drift. I mean, even if you don't do that, it's always going to drift to the extremes in any event, which was the point, part of the point of what was being said. All that is to provide for man to understand that we have an inner foundation and an outer foundation, and we have to have our inner foundation integrated into a whole. And that whole is EOI. That whole is the creator of all, the all-person, the all-one, the all-singularity. That's EOI. The order and system within chaos, seeming chaos. That's EOI. That's the leaf of life. It's always there. It's always here. Right here, we can think of it right there in our heart. It's always here. The 8th cycle represents, among other things, regeneration. We went through these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 7, the limit, boom, the collapse, and now regeneration in the 8th cycle. EOI.